The different routes of Three Houses leave the continent of Fodlan in vastly different situations depending on which route the player picks. Last time we looked into the Black Eagles route's ending, but now we'll be delving into the Silver Snow ending. I said this in my last video in the Fate of Fodlan series, but I'll say it again, just to be clear. My goal in this series is to take a fair and honest look at each of the endings regardless of how I feel about them, to create the most clear image of the pros and cons of each ending. Any difference in opinion when it comes to the validity of each ending comes down to a personal philosophy due to the game's excellent writing. But let's be honest, Silver Snow is obviously the most developed route out of any of them. Alright, now let's get into analyzing the Silver Snow ending, to see if Fodlan even really changes with the church remaining in power, and to see if this change ends up being for the better. The Silver Snow route is an interesting departure from the other routes because its ending is resolved with the church remaining the primary political force within Fodlan, which would lead many to think that little to nothing changes within this route. Well, fortunately for Fodlan and for this route's ending, Silver Snow still changes a lot about the church's situation, despite the issues surrounding its continued power. But, as usual in this series, before we talk about where the church ends up at the end of the route, it'd be best to establish where the church is at the start of the game. The state of the Church of Seiros is somewhat interesting in that, unlike in the case of the standard Three Houses nations, the church is the most fundamental political and religious force in Fodlan, and has had a lot of authority over Fodlan up until the war phase of the game. All three political powers in Fodlan defer to the authority of the church, and it is this authority and power that we witness firsthand in our time as a professor at the Officers Academy. Just the fact that the future leaders of each nation attend an Officers Academy immersed within the church's teachings shows the intellectual power that the church has over all of Fodlan. The various incidents during the White Clouds, where Byla's class is used to enforce the church's authority and to defend against insurgencies in areas such as Fargus, shows the sheer power that the church exercises. Pair the church's military control with the religious domination that the Church of Seiros has, as can be seen in adherence to church festivals such as the Goddess Rite of Rebirth, and it becomes clear that the Church of Seiros really is the group in total control of Fodlan at the game's start. This power can be both a good thing and a bad thing, such as in respective cases of the church helping those in need, as well as the church's crest system causing a litany of social problems within Fodlan. However, cracks begin to show during Lenato's insurgency and events related to Edelgard's conspiracy that reveal the church's flaws as the head of Fodlan. Lord Lenato's rebellion is revealed to have been a reaction to Lenato's son's death. Catherine tells Ashen, their sea support, that Lenato's son was involved in a plot with the Western Church to assassinate Rhea, but the church decided to cover up the truth to keep panic from spreading throughout Fodlan. Then, when the Goddess's Rite of Rebirth gets interrupted by the Western Church, Rhea harshly responds to the intruders by sentencing them to death, showing some of her flaws and imparting personal judgment as Archbishop. Finally, when Rhea is betrayed by Edelgard, she views her as a wicked girl who deserves to be rightfully punished because of her betrayal. There is a clear precedent within White Clouds that the Church, in its current state, has a lot of significant flaws, which all come to change regardless of which route the player chooses when Edelgard starts her rebellion against the Church. Now, moving on into differences that the Silver Snow route has with the others during Part 2, Seteth is there.
We must kill every last one of them.
But seriously though, Seteth ends up taking the role of Lord within the Silver Snow route after Byla splits away from Edelgard, and the route hovers around the idea of letting Ferdinand take a meaningful role, but unfortunately these ideas don't go much further than a couple moments. Eventually, after reuniting the scattered Black Eagles classmates and the church, Byleth and company attack Enbar, ending Edelgard's ambitions and end up killing every last one of the Agarthans in Shambhala, just like in the Verdant Wind route. Finally, after all is said and done, Rhea ends up going berserk after the stress of her injuries at Shambhala, whereby Byleth has to kill her to stop her from destroying Fodlan. Depending on your support level with Rhea, she either dies or survives the ending, leaving a new entirely unified Fodlan under what seems to be church authority.
A rising flame was alight as the flow of time carved a new history for Fodlan. Rhea's wild rampage was put to an end, averting what could have been the greatest crisis in the history of Fodlan. After 5.5 years of war, a new age was set to begin. The Empire, kingdom, and alliance, all political structures that had once shaped the continent, were gone. A unified nation began to take shape under the watchful eye of the Church of Seiros. The Church's new leader became a champion of the people, working tirelessly to help them overcome the horrors of war and to carve out a path towards reconstruction. Just as Saint Seiros tended to those who suffered in wars of the past, Fodlan's new ruler embraced their role as mother of all life and arbiter of every soul.
Now that we have all the context surrounding the church and Fodlan throughout the entirety of the story, let's start looking into some of the benefits of the Silver Snow route. First up is the fact that despite the seeming lack of real change in the church serving as the primary power structure within Fodlan, the ending of the route implies that reform occurs nonetheless, paving the way to an improved future. Byleth takes the helm as the leader of the newly unified Fodlan, serving as the leader of the church and the new nation. And if the player S supports Rhea, she once again assumes her former role of Archbishop. S supporting Rhea creates a little confusion because the ending declares that Byleth is a leader of the church, despite Rhea becoming Archbishop again. But I think it's safe to assume that Byleth simply takes a new role above Archbishop within this new system. Some might be bothered by Rhea potentially continuing to play a role within the church, but the route's ending implies that she would do a better job within the church than she had done previously. With Rhea reflecting on her corrupt and selfish actions before going berserk, and Rhea fully vocalizing the evil she committed and looking to move past them in her S support with Byleth. In their paired ending, it's even implied that Byleth and Rhea work together to create new policies and achieve miraculous progress for Fodlan. It's worth noting that Silver Snow is the only route where Rhea really undergoes this profound character progression and addresses her latent issues with her mother and way of rule. As in Azure Moon and Verdant Wind, Sedith also contributes to the reformation of the church, doing away with his old strictness and adopting a more tolerant stance toward other beliefs. Despite Sedith achieving this in other routes, I think that it's more important in Silver Snow, seeing as the church remains the primary political force in Fodlan. It's also worth noting that the Agarthans are thoroughly destroyed after the church wipes out Shambhala, although Nemesis doesn't show up, so he could either be a problem for the future of the church, or was destroyed in Shambhala. Really, it's hard to say. Finally, the church remaining in power is good in terms of there being continuous stability in Fodlan. In other routes, the other countries will conquer at least one other competitor by force, where there had previously been a somewhat competitive relationship. The new conquest and authority of a unified Adrestia, Fargus, or Leicester alliance could cause instability in the future because their conquered territories might resist submitting to such a new rule. Whereas the church had already been the de facto authority of Fodlan, which would likely be far easier for the people of Fodlan to fully accept. Despite these positives, there are still a lot of negatives that are pretty evident after finishing the Silver Snow route. One of the aforementioned pros of the Silver Snow route ends up being a big problem as well. In the church remaining the primary authority of Fodlan, despite the positives of stability that I explained earlier, the church still was shown to be a fundamentally corrupt institution within the White Cloud section of the game, and many of its institutions that cause plenty of issues for the main cast in the game persist. Because the church remains in power with more or less the same value system, despite some reform, the crest system isn't addressed at all. So plenty of nobles and commoners alike will probably still be plagued by the same issues that Sylvain, Lysithea, and others faced as a result of the crest system. The ending of Silver Snow also implies that the ruling structure of Fodlan hasn't changed much, within the slight caveat of the region being entirely unified instead of being separated into 3 different states. Byleth becomes a de facto ruler of the newly unified Fodlan, as well as the church leaving little room for the same political reforms that take place within the Azure Moon ending. The Silver Snow ending also doesn't describe any leeway being made on opening up Fodlan in the way Claude wanted. So the largest problems plaguing the Silver Snow route ends up being that there really isn't as much radical change for what some would argue would be for the better as in the other 3 routes. As for who won and who lost in Silver Snow, this route sees the most possible failure for many of the main characters from the Officer Academy. Dimitri dies in the Battle of Gronder, Edelgard dies at Enbar, and Claude disappears from Fodlan. But as in other routes, it's implied that Claude either fails to achieve his dream or potentially dies in a different way. The Silver Snow ending isn't a huge loss for the 3 different nations once they're unified though, because they are once again under the rule of church authority, just as in the beginning of the game, with the only change being, as I said before, direct unification. The Agarthans take a huge loss, seeing as they are absolutely obliterated at Shambhala, just like in the Verdant Wind route, and the biggest winners of the route are obviously the Church of Seiros in being able to gain a little authority, more than what they had at the start of the game, and reforming to improve some of its corruption, while Rhea was directly in charge. Rhea is also a big winner, having the most chances to survive within the route, as well as finally being able to have some character progression, acknowledging her wrongs and working to move past them. The Silver Snow route is definitely the least radical one as far as shifts in power and social change goes, but it does have some minor advantages too. Edelgard's revolt causes the church to re-examine the ways it exercises its power, and causes a litany of improvements for the church moving forward. The crest and social systems are completely unaddressed, but the Agarthans are defeated and Fodlan is unified under what we have to assume will be the wise leadership of Violet. This is really the route where Rhea gets saved by being able to recognize her personal and administrative flaws as the Archbishop of the Church, healing the Church from the wounds that it had harbored since the War of Heroes, when Rhea lost everything to the Agarthans. The Silver Snow ending doesn't seem to be a perfect ending, but it's one that moves past the scars of the past, preparing for a brighter future. In my opinion, the Silver Snow route seems to be the weakest route in Three Houses, just due to how closely it resembles the Verdant Wind route, and how it loses the personality of the main lord, and doesn't do much with Seteth or Ferdinand to make up for that. This route did have a great final map though, and it had some interesting themes with Rhea and the church reconciling with the past to move on. As always, I hope that you guys gained some insight into this ending, and I hope that you enjoyed the video. That concludes all 4 major routes in my Fate of Fodlan series, so be sure to check out the other 3 if you haven't already. But before I go, guys, I just want to say I checked the YouTube analytics, and guess what? Only 10% of my watch time comes from people who are subscribed, so be sure to smash that subscribe button, smash that like button, and smash out a comment in the next video. Thanks for watching. But really, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. I've been in a bit of a hiatus, but just to let anybody know who's made it this far and cares to know, I plan to start making more frequent videos. Probably going to be weekly. So, thank you for the continued support, everybody, and until next time.